I'm Kevin Vail, Membership and Northwest Branch Director for the Monroe County YMCA. Today I'm going to teach you how you can make your own charcuterie or serving board at home out of just a simple piece of wood with a little sanding and finish. The first step in doing this process is, of course, securing your piece of wood. I definitely recommend that you do a little research on the different types of wood that are acceptable for this project. Because there are a lot of woods that you want to stay away from. For example, some good woods include American cherry, harder maples, teak, bamboo, olive. Black walnut is also a good one, and black walnut is pretty readily available here in Indiana. But there are a lot of woods that you want to stay away from. Pines, of course, you're going to want to stay away from. You're going to want to stay away from pretty much all oak, and there's some other things that you don't want to use. Poplar. The logic there is that you want to use a hard wood, but moreover, you want a hardwood that is not porous. Oak, for example, is a very hard wood, but it's also very porous, so yeah, stay away from oak. You could certainly go to the hardware store or find a piece of wood from a lumber mill. I was able to get a piece of sugar maple from a local lumber mill, and it's really just a beautiful piece of wood. It's got a live edge here. You'll see it's been rough sewn, meaning that it's not smooth like the boards you would get from Lowe's or Menards, for example. So this will take a little bit more sanding. So first step, like I said, we're going to sand this bad boy down, try and get a nice smooth surface, and go from there. So I have the luxury of having an orbital sander. You don't need to use an orbital sander. You don't need any power tools for this project. You could do this with just sandpaper or a little sanding block. I find these things super convenient. With the orbital sander, which I have, there are different trains of thought on using an orbital sander on a grained wood like this, because the orbital sander by nature spins, so it will be spinning against the grain. With this project, because it is a rough sawed piece of wood, I'm not concerned. I'm going to start with the orbital sander and try and get it smooth, and then go from there. I will move to a hand sander. Please remember that when you're sanding, a lower number on the sandpaper means it's a grittier paper. So for example, I'm going to start with an 80 grit because this is really rough. From there, I'm going to move up to 120, and probably from there jump up to a 220 and see how we look. I think if you were to go to Lowe's or Menards and buy a piece of wood, you could probably start with 180 grit or 220 grit sandpaper to get that nice and smooth. You don't really have to sand it. Obviously this piece needs to be sanded, but you want to get it as smooth as possible. The one thing that I also like to do before I sand is take my chisel, and you could use a chisel. If you don't have one, you could use even like a pocket knife or a screwdriver to look for any really like big chunks or nicks that are bound to come out at some point. This piece of wood that I chose, you can see in the background I have some other pieces. This one is really quite good to go. I just need to sand it down, but there's not any hunks that I'm trying to take out right away. So because I'm using an orbital sander, I want to remind everyone how important it is to use your personal protective equipment. So you're going to want to get a bare minimum some safety glasses if you're using power tools. I recommend using ear protection as well, especially if you're in an indoor environment. Either way, it's a good idea to use these. These are really affordable and definitely worth their cost if you're going to be tackling a project using some power tools. You'll use them for multiple projects. You could use them when you mow your lawn, or you're doing countless different things. So we're going to go ahead and put a first sanding on this, see where we stand, and then possibly do another pass with the sander. So the first pass with the sander went really well. It was able to pull out some of those mill marks, as I like to call them. It's marks you see in rough sewn pieces of lumber as they pass through a sawmill that's usually operated by a chainsaw. So we're going to move down from that 80 grit sandpaper. I'm going to jump to 120 grit sandpaper and do another pass and see where we are after that. All right, so that went very well. We're moving down, we're getting smoother and smoother. One thing that I recommend doing, and I didn't mention this earlier in the video, is from the beginning you want to decide what is the top. You know, which part do you want to be the top, the main piece of the charcuterie board? Because I know that this is my top, I'm not going to spend as much time on the bottom. You still want it to be smooth, but it doesn't have to look as appealing as the top does. So 120 grit went very well. We're going to switch down to 220 grit and see if we can keep getting smoother and smoother. Right, so that's about as far as I'd like to go with using the orbital sander. From here, I'm going to sand by hand. You can see there's still some marks in the board from where it would pass through the sawmill, but for this project, that's okay. I chose this wood because of the live edge. I like the character it has. I like the different coloring it has. So for me, there being some marking on it, that's all right. You might feel differently and want to get yours completely smooth, but I like mine to be smooth but not perfect. I like the imperfections in the wood. So I'm going to switch to this sanding block here. Using a sanding block or hand sandpaper allows you to focus on areas that need a little more attention. By doing this, you're still smoothing the surface out. It's just at a much slower pace. All right, so like I said, I'm okay with it being a little rougher. I like where it's at right now. So next we're gonna look at how we're going to add some decorative touches. Then we'll move into how we're gonna finish this. All right, so we're done sanding. We have a nice smooth surface. Now is the part where if you'd like to add some decorative items to your board, you could certainly do so now. I've seen people use a stencil and draw in pencil on the wood and use a wood burning iron, which you could purchase at Menards, Lowe's, any hardware store, or even like Hobby Lobby or Michael's to add a decorative design. I'm going to use a brand today to put a brand on this. You know, as we advance through this pandemic that we're in, we all have friends and colleagues that we're missing. One of the people that I'm missing is Vicki Edmiston that works in our accounting department at the Y. Vicki has been with the Y for almost since its beginning inception here in Monroe County. So as our Y celebrates our 40th anniversary, Vicki in a way is celebrating an anniversary as well. So I'm making this board today for Vicki and I'm gonna brand it with a V. You will notice that before I fire up my blowtorch here, I've moved all of the flammable items off my workbench. I have opened the garage so that there's ample airflow. You wanna definitely make sure that you're taking extreme safety precautions whenever you're working with fire, obviously. I think the thing to keep in mind is you'll notice I moved a can of mineral spirits in WD-40, for example. I also moved my paper towel, but I also moved the finish that I'm gonna be using. Most finishes that you would use on wood, be it a stained polyurethane, they're gonna be extremely flammable. Even just the vapor of those is flammable. So please exercise extreme caution whenever you're using fire in a project, anytime you're using fire at all. So we'll go ahead and fire up the torch. We're going to want to get this brand scalding hot, and we want to only hit it one time. If we have to do it multiple times, we run the risk of shadowing the brand, as I like to call it. So we'll go ahead and fire this up. Wow, that turned out great. One thing that I didn't speak to, but you'll notice that I did, is I did use a landscape stone. Obviously my workbench is made of wood with a plastic Coca-Cola sign here on top. So I brought in a landscape stone so that I knew I was safely heating up the brand. If you look, I was able to get a pretty deep V on that brand, which is great. I like to sand a little bit around the edges using that sanding sponge that I have to make sure that the V really pops out. So we will go ahead and do that once this cools. So here we have it. We're all sanded down. We have added our decorative V for Vicky, and we are ready to seal it. We'll get into that next, so stay with me. All right, so before we put a coat of finish on this, I recommend using a product called a tack cloth. Anytime you do a project that involves any sanding. What a tack cloth is it's a almost sticky piece of cheesecloth, and that will go in, get in all the nooks and crannies and pull out any sawdust that may be left behind. You know, when you run your hand across it, you could still feel sawdust in there. So we're gonna run this tack cloth across it and hopefully peel out some of that sawdust. They won't damage any of the wood or leave any sort of staining, so it's really a great product. Up and instantly I could feel the difference in the wood. And you could see on my tack cloth how much sawdust, dirt, and grime I was able to pull out of this piece of wood. So now we are in a position that we are ready to apply our first coat of finish. All right, so now we're ready to apply our first coat of finish. There are multiple products out on the market right now that are labeled as food safe. If you do some research online, there's even mineral oil mixtures that you could use to seal your charcuterie board. I have used this product by Howard before, and it's a good product called Butcher's Block Conditioner. But today I'm going to use a product by Watco called Butcher Block Oil and Finish. I really like this. It's food safe, but the reason why I like it is it applies smooth, evenly. It's an easy product to work with, and it dries fairly quick, and it dries in a manner that's desirable. So we're gonna go ahead and put a coat of this on. According to the instructions, we're going to allow this to dry for 6 hours before we apply an additional coat. And we want it to dry for 3 days, 72 hours before we actually use this. To start, I'm gonna put a coat on top, and I'm gonna try and hit my live edge here as well. You'll notice that I never sanded the live edge. I did try and clean it up a little bit with the tack cloth, and at one point before I started the video, I just kind of picked away any rough marks. I like the live edge. I love the sapwood that's behind it, so I always try and leave that there. So we'll go ahead and get started with this Watco Butcher's Block oil. I did stir the can when I wasn't on video. Anytime you use a finish or stain, try not to shake it. You're gonna wanna thoroughly stir it. I like to start in the middle and work my way out. Everyone has a different technique when it comes to staining, finishing, and painting. You'll notice this product darkens the color a little bit, but it doesn't really change the color like a stain would or there's no dye in it. Anytime you're applying any sort of finish or stain, you're going to want to apply with the grain. There are different techniques that you could use. One of those techniques is a pour over, in which you literally pour the finish on and then smooth it out with a putty knife or a similar product. Because I know this isn't perfectly flat, I mean, that's not a technique that I want to use on this, and the paintbrush just works just fine because we are going for that kind of rustic look. All right, that'll do it for the first coat of finish. From here, we're gonna wait 6 hours for this to dry. Gives you the opportunity to clean up, get some things done. However, you do not want to touch this before 6 hours. You really want to allow for that full cure time. So we'll be back. We'll see you in 6 hours. All right, hello and welcome back, everyone. We are ready to put another coat of finish here on our charcuterie board. I will say that it has been well over 6 hours. I came down and I put another coat on the top about 6 hours later, and I also put a coat on the bottom as well. So I'm gonna put one more coat on the top and call it good. You can really go 3, 4, 5 coats. You're not gonna hurt anything putting it more coats on. You're definitely gonna wanna put at least 2 coats on. So I will put another coat around the bottom as well. Before I get started with the finish, remember it's called Watco Butcher's Block Oil and Finish. You do want to lightly sand in between coats of finish. Again, I have a 320 grit sanding sponge. You don't need the sponge, you could just use sandpaper. You could really go to most any hardware store and get just a sheet of 300 or even 420 grit sanding paper for about $1, maybe $2. So we're gonna lightly scuff this up. We're not gonna try and remove anything. We're not gonna try and go crazy. And then we'll put a final coat of finish on it. From there, I could talk about some of the ways that you can add pieces to your charcuterie board, some added features, and then I will take some photos of the finished product and make sure they get added to the end of the video once everything's done drying. So we're gonna take our sanding block and just lightly scuff up this board. Anything you're sanding, you're always gonna wanna make sure you go with the grain. We talked about that a little bit earlier. All right, so that's looking good. You can see that it definitely peeled some of the finish off. You don't want to go crazy with it, but just to rough it up. Again, we're going to take our tack cloth and make sure that we pull off any of that sawdust. These tack cloths are definitely worth their cost. All right, feeling nice and smooth. Another method that I didn't really talk about much earlier, really the classic method for any sort of finish, is using a cloth. You could use a microfiber cloth. I recommend washing it first to make sure there's no debris on it. What I found is the best cloth to use is just an old t-shirt that's been washed a lot. Cut off a little section and you can use it for this. One thing that I like to do, like I said, I put another coat on the top, waited for that to dry, I put a coat on the bottom. I've been sealing and finishing this rough edge every time I put a coat on the top or bottom. With the live edge, I'm only doing that when I'm putting a coat on the top. But because this rough edge is so prone to absorbing that finish, I've been going heavy on that. So that's one technique that I like to do. You certainly don't have to do that. So I have noticed that I lost a few bristles from my brush in this coat of finish. It's a risk you run really anytime you're painting or finishing anything. I run a higher risk because I'm using a super cheap paintbrush right now. So I'm gonna use just a simple hook pick and try and fish these out, and then I'll go back over it again. Obviously I disrupted the smoothness of the finish, so I'm just going to try and feather back in what I had to fix. All right, so we're going to let that dry for, again, at least 6 hours. Once this is dry, we'll be all done. I did want to touch on a couple finishing pieces. I bought these handles initially with the idea that I would add them to each side of this tray. You could do it on the top or the side, really, either way. I definitely recommend, if you're adding handles, pre-drill the holes because especially with this type of lumber, you run the risk of splitting the wood. I really like the way this looks, so I don't think I'm going to add these handles. They're just a couple bucks at the hardware store, so hopefully I'll use them in the future for a different project. You'll probably notice that throughout the whole video, this had a little bit of wobble to it. You're going to have that too with any piece of rough sawed lumber that you get, unless you have a planer or can run it through a planer. This wood has not been run through a planer. If you buy wood at the hardware store, such as Lowe's, Menards, Black Lumber, any real local retailer, that will probably be a lot smoother. But one way to counteract that is to add simple chair glides. These are just a little piece of plastic with a nail sticking out of it, so you can tap these into the bottom. That's one way. The way I like to do it, it's less permanent, is just using furniture glides. These simple furniture pads underneath. I'll add one in the four corners and that'll prevent it from rocking. Again, this project is really, really easy. From my point of view, the final result is oftentimes dictated by the piece of wood that you get. Like I said, you could certainly go and get a piece of maple from Menards or Lowe's, but I encourage you, if you're going to tackle this project, to get on Craigslist and see if you could find any local sawmills that are selling wood. You could certainly just Google it as well. I hope that you were able to learn a little bit about how to make a charcuterie board. It's a simple process. It's a great gift for weddings, birthdays, that sort of thing, or just to let someone know that you're thinking of them. Please stay safe, stay healthy. We look forward to seeing you all at the YMCA very soon. Take care.